What does it say about a man, or perhaps about his enemies, when the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth spends nearly 5 decades trying to kill him, deploys exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits, a chemically treated pen, a contaminated diving suit, a femme fatale with pills hidden in a cold cream jar, and a seashell packed with explosives placed on the ocean floor, and still fails? Every single time. Not once, not twice. The Cuban government's official count lands somewhere around 638 attempts. The verified number, by more conservative historians, sits at around 6. But honestly, even one exploding cigar should settle the argument. Something extraordinary was happening here, and it wasn't luck. Or maybe it was entirely luck. That, as it turns out, is the most disturbing possibility of all. To understand why so many people wanted Fidel Castro dead, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1959. The Cold War was not a metaphor. It was a genuine daily rehearsal for civilizational collapse. 2 superpowers were dividing the planet into spheres of influence like 2 men splitting a pizza neither of them cooked, and 90 miles off the coast of Florida, 90 miles the distance of a long Sunday drive, a young lawyer with a beard and a philosophy degree had just taken over an entire country. He then announced calmly and without apparent irony that he was a communist. Washington did not take this well. The CIA, an organization that had already overthrown governments in Iran and Guatemala and was developing something of a habit, turned its considerable attention toward Havana. What followed was one of the longest, most expensive, most creative, and most catastrophically unsuccessful campaigns of political elimination in recorded history. Before he was a symbol, before he was the beard on a revolutionary poster, before he was the man Kennedy couldn't kill, Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was a Cuban lawyer with a talent for speeches so long they became a kind of performance art. His 1960 address to the United Nations lasted 4 hours and 29 minutes. The delegates, by all accounts, were not uniformly delighted. Castro was not a simple man. He was intelligent in the way that makes people dangerous, not because intelligence itself is dangerous, but because he combined it with absolute certainty, which is the point at which intelligence stops asking questions and starts issuing orders. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of someone who has never seriously doubted himself, that the Cuban people needed liberation from American-backed corruption. He was not entirely wrong about the corruption, the liberation part. History will argue about indefinitely. He was also, and this cannot be overstated, a man who appeared to genuinely enjoy surviving. There is an interview in which Castro discusses the attempts on his life with the casual warmth most people reserve for discussing minor inconveniences, as if the CIA were a persistent but ultimately charming neighbor who kept leaving unpleasant things on his doorstep. He once said that if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, he would win the gold medal. He said this with pride. That tells you everything. If you find yourself fascinated by the kind of historical figures who make you question everything you thought you understood about power, this channel tends to specialize in exactly that kind of trouble. Subscribing would make you complicit in the habit. The CIA's campaign against Castro was not a single dramatic decision. It was a committee, which, if you think about it, explains a great deal. The operation that would become known under various classified names went through 8 American presidencies. 8. Eisenhower authorized the first serious plots. Kennedy inherited them. Launched the catastrophic Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which failed so completely it nearly became performance art, and then continued authorizing assassination plots through a program called Operation Mongoose, which employed over 400 CIA officers and cost over $50 million annually. For context, that was serious money in the early 1960s. For more context, it produced nothing. The plots themselves deserve their own chapter in the history of human overconfidence. The CIA consulted with the American Mafia, because the Mafia had casinos in Cuba before the revolution and wanted them back. A partnership that should have concerned someone at the ethics level, but apparently did not. They developed a poisoned cigar, They developed a pill provided to a Cuban official who lost his nerve and kept it in his refrigerator for several months before eventually flushing it. They investigated whether Castro's boots could be contaminated with thallium salts to make his famous beard fall out. The theory being without apparent supporting evidence that the beard was the source of his authority. They proposed an exploding conch shell. This was a real proposal by real professionals. Someone was paid to think of this. Each failure generated a new plan. Each new plan was more elaborate and less connected to reality than the last. There is a psychological term for this, escalation of commitment. But there is also a simpler term, which is pride. Once you have tried to kill a man with a poison pen, it becomes difficult to simply stop. You have made a statement about what kind of organization you are. The closest the CIA came, by most accounts, involved a Cuban official named Rolando Cubella, codenamed AMLASH, who agreed to assassinate Castro in exchange for American support. He was given a ballpoint pen rigged with a hypodermic needle containing black leaf 40, a lethal poison. The pen was delivered on November 22, 1963. That was the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. History occasionally has the audacity to be on the nose. Cubella never acted. The pen disappeared into the general chaos of events. Castro, as was becoming a pattern, lived. He heard about the Kennedy assassination on the radio that same afternoon and reportedly said immediately that this meant trouble for Cuba, that whoever killed Kennedy would try to blame it on Havana. He understood the geometry of power faster than most governments understand their own policy documents. The femme fatale attempt is worth pausing on. Marita Lorenz, an American woman who had genuinely been Castro's lover, was recruited by the CIA to return to Havana and poison him. She smuggled pills inside a jar of cold cream. When she arrived, when she was face to face with the man again, she hesitated. Castro, according to her own account, looked at her and said simply that he knew why she was there and handed her his gun. She gave him the pills. He swallowed nothing. She left Cuba. Human beings, it turns out, are complicated. This is the fact that most political violence fails to account for. Castro outlived Eisenhower. He outlived Kennedy. He outlived Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and the second Bush. He watched the Soviet Union collapse, which eliminated his primary benefactor, plunged Cuba into a period of genuine deprivation called the Special Period, and still did not remove him from power. He handed authority to his brother Raul in 2008, officially retired in 2011, and died peacefully in his bed in November 2016 at the age of 90. He was 90 years old. The men who spent the 1960s planning to kill him were mostly long dead. The CIA's campaign against him had long since become a historical footnote, occasionally trotted out in congressional hearings as evidence that government agencies are capable of spectacular, sustained, expensive failure without significant organizational consequence. Cuba remained poor. Cuba remained isolated. The embargo the United States implemented in 1962, intended to strangle the Castro government economically into collapse, remained in place in various forms for decades. It is still largely in place. The primary result of the embargo was, if we are being precise, the continued suffering of ordinary Cubans, while Castro himself explained American hostility to his own population as proof that he was correct. The tool designed to remove him became the argument for why he should stay. This is the kind of irony that ancient Greeks would have recognized immediately, and which modern policymakers seem constitutionally unable to anticipate. If you appreciate history delivered without the mercy of simplified conclusions, the subscribe button is right there. No pressure. Castro certainly would have clicked it out of spite. There is a version of this story that's funny. 600 assassination attempts, exploding cigars, poisoned beard treatments, a pen that delivered its hypodermic payload on the single most symbolically loaded day of the 20th century. It is, in a certain light, a comedy, a farce written by a committee executed by professionals, failing spectacularly in slow motion over 5 decades. But there is another version of this story that is not funny at all. In this version, You notice that every serious assassination attempt required a network of human beings who agreed that killing was the appropriate solution to a political disagreement. Mafia figures, government officials, intelligence officers who went to good universities and had families and probably considered themselves reasonable people. You notice that this network was funded by democratic governments representing democratic populations, none of whom were asked whether they approved of exploding seashells as foreign policy instruments. You notice that the attempts failed largely not because of moral resistance, but because of logistical incompetence. And you are forced to conclude that the difference between the history that happened and a darker one was often nothing more consequential than a lost nerve, a refrigerator, or a shell that did not go off. Castro was not a saint. He imprisoned dissidents. He restricted speech. He executed opponents. His Cuba was not a paradise of revolutionary equality. It was an authoritarian state with better literacy rates than most of its neighbors, and far less freedom than any of its defenders admitted. The honest accounting of his legacy requires holding both of these things at once, which is something the human brain resists with considerable energy, preferring instead the clean comfort of a verdict. What the story of the assassination attempts actually reveals is not something particular about Castro. It reveals something about power itself, that those who hold it will spend almost any amount of money and moral credibility to preserve it, and that those who oppose it will spend the same, and that across all of this expenditure, across all of this planning and poisoning and conspiring, ordinary life continues. Ordinary people suffer the consequences of decisions made far above them, and the figures at the center of it all, the targets, the planners, the true believers on every side, become myths before they are even finished being human. Fidel Castro died in a bed, surrounded presumably by people 90 years old, having outlasted not just his enemies, but the entire ideological framework that produced them. History does not always deliver the verdict we expect. It does not always deliver justice. Sometimes it delivers 90 years, a peaceful death, and the cold, quiet irony of a legacy no one can quite agree on. Perhaps that is the most honest thing power ever admits, that it was never really about the man. It was always about what the man represented and what his enemies feared they might become without him to push against. The most dangerous thing a man can be is not armed. It is unnecessary.